Welcome everyone. I hope you're all having an engaging and educational morning, and welcome to my presentation on refugees in the media and politics. Before I begin, I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I record, the Bedegal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. The world as we know it today is founded on the idea of the nation-state. As discussed in Haddad 2003, in order for sovereign states to remain the centre of modern globalised society, it is increasingly crucial for them to create a strong sense of self, a national mythos that supports the idea of a country. For people who have spent all or most of their life living in one country, this national myth may form a large part of their personal identity and sense of self. The problem arises when this national selfhood is predicated, as it often is, on exclusion. Today I'm going to talk about how the Australian government for the past 20 or so years has used exclusionary national myths and dehumanising language to garner support for draconian and xenophobic refugee policies, many of which are in contravention of the 1951 Refugee Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Nation-states tend to define themselves in terms of the other, defining what they are not as much as what they are. They create a sense of familiarity and security for the populace. They allow people an identity and a feeling of being part of something, and it's this feeling of community that politicians and the media draw on when justifying the exclusion of certain groups. In the case of Australia's refugee policies, this has taken the form of framing offshore detention of asylum seekers and refugees as border protection. Even including the asylum seekers into the portfolio of immigration and border protection, as was the case until 2017, only serves to strengthen this image. By implying that these policies are a form of protection, the government's narrative taps into the fears of the populace and creates a sense that there is something they need to be protected from. When terms such as border protection are used in reference to asylum seekers, the implication is that these people are a threat to Australia, to Australians, and to their way of life. As McLaren and Patil in 2016 mention, this construction of the other is a powerful one, and one that has become more and more prevalent in the years since the September 11 attacks, though it was always present in Australia's immigration and border policies. The media reinforces this idea by focusing on a binary opposition between good, moral Australians and the asylum seekers, who are framed as a threat or, in milder cases, as a burden. Even once they have been integrated into the community, media reporting focuses on the separation between Australians and refugees. Reporting on how much asylum seekers cost in welfare payments, how often they're present in hospitals, and how long it takes them to get a job, continues to separate them from other Australians and creates a sense of burden and differentiation between them and other Australians. A brief survey of the Sydney Morning Herald article titles over the past 5 years clearly demonstrates this trend. The language used in creating this sense of the other is particularly important in understanding how this narrative can work on people's minds. We can see this in this construction in the beginning, in the early 2000s, with the infamous Tampa incident and the children overboard scandal. The media's representation of these asylum seekers mirrored that given by the Prime Minister John Howard, that these illegal, immoral people were willing to throw their children overboard in order to get into the country. Saxon in 2003 and McLaren and Patil in 2016 discussed the effect of the Prime Minister's reactions. This framing created an idea of asylum seekers as deviants, as monsters with no sense of decency. After all, if they were genuine asylum seekers, they would have come by legal means rather than paying people smugglers. These representations ignored the nuances of the situation and gave no consideration to the desperation that might cause someone to behave in that manner. They were illegals and queue jumpers. They were not people. They were criminals. In the famous words of the Prime Minister on national radio, "I certainly don't want people like that here." The power of that phrase, "people like that," is undeniable. It at once distances and demonizes, and it strengthens the dichotomy of us and them. It implies that these people are not like this and not like us, and that the difference makes them dangerous and threatening. The criminalisation of refugees did not stop with the end of John Howard's prime ministership either. In response to the 2019 Med-Evac bill, Scott Morrison's finance minister, Mr. Cormann, threatened that the bill, which was intended to allow refugee asylum seekers in offshore detention access to medical aid, would open the door for racists and pedophiles to enter the country. There is nothing subtle about the language used here. The response to a bill allowing people to gain medical assistance, being referred to as rapists and pedophiles, only builds on and reinforces the narrative started so many years ago. Not only will refugees throw their children into the ocean, but now they're rapists as well. Though Mr. Cormann would doubtlessly claim he didn't intend to imply that all refugees were rapists, the distinction is unclear. His words reinforce the story that refugees are criminals and people that we shouldn't want in our country. The language used by politicians during the early 2000s blurred the lines between asylum seekers, refugees, and illegal immigrants. Each of these groups are distinct categories of people. A refugee is someone who has had their claim verified, so there is no such thing as a genuine refugee, because if their claim is not genuine, then they are not considered a refugee. A refugee is not an asylum seeker, and they are not an illegal immigrant, but by using these terms interchangeably, the government was able to implicate asylum seekers as being illegal, even though the right to seek asylum is codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A person's validity as an asylum seeker or a refugee is not undermined by the manner in which they choose or are forced to arrive in a country, but that is the dichotomy that the government was able to draw through their misleading language choices. Genuine refugees are accepted through the UNHCR resettlement programs, and everyone else is illegal. However, the narrative surrounding asylum seekers did not stop with labelling them as illegal. The portrayal of refugees not only in Australia but around the world is almost uniformly dehumanising. The general public do not, in general, have much contact with refugees, and so it's easy to divorce the idea of the refugee from the humans actually involved. Abid, Manan and Rahman's 2017 study of language surrounding Syrian refugees showed that metaphors in the media frequently use dehumanising language to refer to refugees in terms of floods, waves, and as human cargo. These terms reduce refugees to problems to be managed or objects to be offloaded. The war against illegal immigrants builds on this threatening language. These metaphors are emotionally charged and emphasize the idea that asylum seekers are burdensome or threatening. It places the refugees into the same category as natural disasters, an unstoppable force, an overwhelming, terrifying thing that's coming to swamp civilized society. Even the coalition government's last election slogan to "stop the boats" removed the human factor from the equation. These metaphors are, in a sense, even worse than focusing on the possibility that asylum seekers may be criminals or terrorists. It removes any sense of humanity altogether. Suddenly, there is no longer a humanitarian requirement involved. They are nothing more than indistinguishable entities, not people at all. These images help to create the narrative of a crisis, which was exactly how Prime Minister Tony Abbott framed the situation of the Rohingya refugees in 2015, all the while emphasising, nope, nope, nope. Australia will do absolutely nothing that gives any encouragement. If you want to start a new life, you come through the front door. The crisis of possibly as many as 8,000 refugees stranded at sea was framed as a breakdown of border policing and not as a humanitarian problem. To anyone who consumes mainstream media news, these terms will not be unfamiliar. Though John Howard was responsible for creating the narrative "the queue jumper," successive governments, both Labour and Coalition, have perpetuated it. This language and this framing of refugees has continued through the past 20 years of rigid border control, offshore detention, and extreme attempts to dissuade asylum seekers from attempting to resettle in Australia. The incident of the SIEV 221 in 2010 is an example. Over 50 asylum seekers were killed when the boat carrying them smashed into rocks off Christmas Island. Instead of considering the tragedy of the deaths of so many people trying to escape persecution, the dominant media narrative was twisted to further the agenda of stopping the boats. Not so much for the good of the refugees aboard them, but because the Australian people didn't want those deaths on their conscience. This is despite the fact that 99.2% of asylum seeker boats arrive safely at their destination. It's more comforting for people to believe that it's in the best interest of refugees to deter and prevent their arrival by sea, without considering what forces might drive someone to attempt such a dangerous voyage, even knowing that all that awaits them is years locked up in detention. Media and political representations of refugees do not occur in a vacuum, however. And in today's society, the image is almost more powerful than the word. In 2002, Wright wrote about how in our visual culture, the image of refugees is reinforced by the pictures displayed beside our news articles and shown during the reporting of televised news. The complexities of refugee representation in the media grow deeper when visual imagery is included. The refugee in this context is a figure both pitiable and threatening. The visual image most people associate with refugees and asylum seekers today plays a crucial role in how people construct their beliefs. And the image that most people have of asylum seekers or refugees is usually of either ethnic-looking women, brown-skinned, usually in traditional dress, with large-eyed, sad-looking children in their arms, or of Middle Eastern men protesting in detention centres, their faces blurred, shot through chain-link fences. I did not have to look hard to find these three images from a Google search for refugee. These images capture the strange dichotomy of the refugee in the public mind. They are both vulnerable and threatening, pitiable yet dangerous. This contradictory dichotomy can be rationalised as, it's very sad, but they shouldn't have tried to game the system. If they'd just come the right way, they could have gotten help. And it's a rationalisation that ignores the complexities and challenges of being recognised as a refugee, or even of making it to a country where you can be recognised as a refugee. And yet, when people are bombarded every day with these sorts of images and stories, they may begin to suffer from compassion fatigue, and the plight of these people becomes disconnected from reality. Despite the history of problematic representation of refugees by governments and the media alike, there is change in the air. More and more news articles and stories are beginning to challenge the dominant narrative, and more Australians are starting to become aware of the manipulation and becoming more tuned into the reality of offshore detention. Modern technology and activist movements are starting to bring light to the personal stories of asylum seekers, their names, their stories, their families, and their lives. A recent interview with the former president of Nauru, which was originally aired on the project and then published in the Sydney Morning Herald just last month, talks about how he sees his agreement with the Australian government to be a deal with the devil. He discussed how he thought he was helping refugees, but eventually realised the detention centres were a form of torture. The article, far from taking the usual stance that those in offshore detention are criminals and deviants, reports instead on the number of deaths by suicide and the international criticism of the centres. The Medevac bill is another example of a shift, however slight, in Australia's treatment of refugees. Although the coalition government opposed the bill and responded to its passing by reopening the Christmas Island Detention Centre, threatening that masses of refugees would push Australians off waiting lists and that people would use the bill to try and game the system, they have actually been heavily criticised for that move. Many have labelled the reopening of Christmas Island as an expensive stunt, and the Labor government is running a very slightly more lenient platform in the upcoming election. While the coalition government is still sticking close to its original narrative, it is coming under increasing criticism for its treatment of refugees. Tim Winton's 2015 plea sums up the painful truth. Fear has turned us. In the past 15 years, it's eaten into our public spirit and made a travesty of our most sacred values, the very things we thought we stood for as a society. Our sense of decency, fairness, justice, compassion, and openness. The statement is a recognition of the damage of the narrative sold to us by the politicians. It is time we did better, and the crumbling of the dehumanisation and criminalisation of refugees and asylum seekers is the beginning. While there is still a long way to go in Australia's representation of refugees and asylum seekers, I can only hope that we are starting to see changes and that the people of Australia start to think more critically about the narrative that's being created by successive governments. All it will take is for a critical mass to decide that asylum seekers are human beings who deserve our respect and protection, to change Australia's sense of self from one that is exclusionary and xenophobic to one of acceptance and kindness. Thank you all for coming and listening to my presentation. I am really looking forward to watching some of the others, and yeah, thanks.